106 years! That's how long it took America to admit it had made a mistake, convicting 19 men in the largest mass execution in the Army's history. How did one brave woman force them to admit it? Graduate student Angela Holder sat in a Louisiana library, hands shaking as she read the final pages of Dr. Robert Haynes's book, A Night of Violence, The Houston Riot of 1917. For 20 years since she was 6 years old, she'd been searching for her great-uncle Jesse Moore. Her Aunt Lovey had shown her his photograph, told her the Army had killed him, that nobody knew where he was buried. She was never a sad person until she talked about her brother, Holder would recall decades later. And that's when I said, I'm going to make her happy about that. Aunt Lovey had died just months after showing Angela that photograph, but the promise remained. And on that day, in 1987, Holder found what she'd been looking for. Page 247, a footnote. Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery, San Antonio, Texas. 17 soldiers from the 24th Infantry Regiment, executed December 11th, 1917. Buried in unmarked graves. Corporal Jesse Moore was noose number 7. August 23rd, 1917, Houston, Texas. The temperature hit 95 degrees by mid-afternoon. Corporal Charles Baltimore, military police officer with the all-black 24th Infantry Regiment, walked down San Felipe Street, investigating a disturbance. A white Houston police officer named Lee Sparks had arrested a black soldier earlier that morning. Baltimore, wearing his Army uniform and badge, approached Officer Sparks to inquire about the arrest. What happened next would set in motion events that would culminate in the largest murder trial in American history. Sparks pistol-whipped Baltimore across the head with his service revolver. When Baltimore tried to escape, Sparks fired 3 shots at him. Baltimore managed to run back toward Camp Logan, the military training facility where his battalion was stationed, blood streaming down his face. Within hours, rumors spread through the camp that white civilians were forming a mob to attack the black soldiers. The rumors were false, but after weeks of relentless racist harassment from Houston police and white civilians, after watching their fellow soldiers beaten and arrested for minor violations of Jim Crow laws, after enduring slurs and threats while wearing the uniform of the United States Army, the men of the 24th Infantry had reached their breaking point. Around 8 o'clock that evening, approximately 156 soldiers armed themselves with rifles and ammunition. They marched from Camp Logan toward downtown Houston. The march lasted roughly 2 hours. When it ended, 19 people were dead, 4 black soldiers, 15 white civilians, including 5 police officers and Army Captain J.W. Mattes. The violence was chaotic, scattered across several miles of Houston streets. Some soldiers fired indiscriminately. Others deliberately targeted police officers. Several civilians testified later that soldiers had warned them to stay off the streets, suggesting not all the troops participated in the killings. The Army's response was swift and overwhelming. Within days, every man in the battalion was disarmed and placed under guard. 118 soldiers were charged with mutiny and murder. The trials would begin within weeks. November 1st, 1917. Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio. 63 black soldiers sat in a makeshift courtroom facing charges of mutiny, murder, and aggravated assault. They shared one defense attorney. Major Harry Greer was not a lawyer. He'd been given 10 days to prepare a defense for 63 men facing capital charges. The largest murder trial in American history. 10 days. One non-attorney. The prosecution called witnesses who couldn't identify specific defendants. The defense was allowed minimal cross-examination. The trial lasted less than a month. On November 28th, the court-martial panel delivered its verdict. 13 soldiers sentenced to death. 41 sentenced to life in prison at hard labor. 4 given lesser sentences for testifying against their comrades. 5 acquitted. The condemned men were not informed of their sentences. They were not given the right to appeal. They were not told they would die. December 9th, 1917, 2 days before the execution. The 13 condemned soldiers learned their fate. Army engineers worked through the night constructing a massive wooden gallows near Salado Creek. Designed with a single large trap door that would allow all 13 men to be hanged simultaneously. At sunrise on December 11th, before anyone outside the military even knew the executions had been ordered, the 13 soldiers were led to the gallows. Corporal Jesse Moore was 27 years old. He'd enlisted at 16. He'd served in the Philippines and Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa with General John Pershing. He'd been promoted to corporal just 5 months earlier. In his final letter to his mother, written after learning his sentence, Moore maintained his innocence. "I was sentenced to be hanged for the trouble that happened in Houston, Texas, although I am not guilty of the crime I am accused of," he wrote. "When you read this letter, I will be in glory." The letter arrived at his mother's Louisiana home, along with his coat, his Bible, and $1. She never recovered from the loss. Moore hung at noose number 7. The execution was completed by 7 in the morning. By noon, Army engineers had dismantled the gallows. There was no sign anything had happened. The Army executed 6 more soldiers after subsequent trials, 19 men total, the largest mass execution of American soldiers by the United States military in history. 60 additional soldiers received life sentences. Most would die in prison. The bodies of the 13 men executed first were buried in unmarked graves near Salado Creek, numbered 1 through 13 corresponding to their noose positions. For 20 years, Jesse Moore's mother didn't know where her son was buried. In 1937, concerned that flooding might unearth the bodies, the Army exhumed the remains and reinterred them at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. They installed headstones, but the stones contained only names and a date: December 11th, 1917. No service record, no rank, no acknowledgement of the 60 years the 24th Infantry had served with distinction. Nothing but death. The outrage over the secret executions was immediate. One of the officers on the tribunal, learning that the men had been hanged and buried before any review, was reportedly outraged. In January 1918, just 1 month after the executions, the Army issued General Order No. 7, requiring all death sentences to undergo review before execution. 10 soldiers later sentenced to death in subsequent Camp Logan trials were spared because of this new rule. President Woodrow Wilson commuted their sentences after public protests. The Army had implicitly admitted the executions were wrong, but the convictions stood, and the men remained dead. Jesse Moore's brother Joseph traveled to Washington, D.C., seeking information about where his brother was buried. The Army denied his request. The Freedom of Information Act wouldn't pass for another 3 years. Joseph died in 1985, never knowing his brother's fate. 2 years later, his great-niece Angela found what he couldn't. Armed with the information from Haynes' book, Holder wrote to the Pentagon. They confirmed Jesse Moore was buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. They sent her a copy of his military service certificate. It read, "Service terminated by death without honor." Holder was working on her graduate degree in history. She visited the cemetery for the first time. Row after row of white headstones, each telling a story of service, names, ranks, dates of birth and death, wars fought. Then she reached the row containing Jesse Moore's grave, name, date of death. "That's all. Ours don't have a story," Holder said. "They just have name and date of death." For the next 14 years, Holder researched the Houston Riot while building her career as a history professor at Houston Community College. She organized commemorations, she curated museum exhibits, she lobbied the Veterans Association to place proper headstones at the graves of 2 soldiers killed during the riot and buried in Houston. She became the keeper of the story, ensuring the Camp Logan incident wouldn't disappear from history. But keeping the memory alive wasn't enough. In 2001, Holder returned to Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. This time, she had a mission. She walked to each of the 17 graves. She touched each headstone. "I remember going to each tombstone and saying, 'I'm going to do something,'" she recalled years later. "I didn't know what, and I didn't know how, but I wanted to make this right." She just needed to figure out how to force the United States Army to overturn convictions that were nearly a century old. Holder found her ally, Clyde Lemon, chair of the Houston NAACP's Armed Services and Veterans Affairs Committee, shared her passion for justice. Together, they began pushing for posthumous pardons for the executed soldiers. They approached the Army directly. The Army refused. The convictions, they said, were legally sound. The trials had followed the procedures of 1917. There was no basis for overturning them. Holder and Lemon needed a different approach. They needed someone who understood military law from the inside, someone who could speak the Army's language. In 2018, they approached Professor Jeffrey Korn at South Texas College of Law, Houston. Korn had served as a lieutenant colonel and Army judge advocate. He understood military justice. And when Holder posed a simple question, she captured his attention completely. If the Army felt that it had done the right thing, Holder asked, then why did they issue General Order No. 7? The question was devastating in its simplicity. The Army had changed its execution procedures within weeks of the Camp Logan hangings, essentially admitting the process had been flawed, but they'd never revisited the convictions themselves. Korn realized something crucial. Holder and Lemon had been seeking pardons, which implied the soldiers were guilty, but deserving of mercy. That would never work. The Army would never admit it had executed innocent men. But what if the issue wasn't guilt or innocence? What if the issue was process? What if the trials themselves were so fundamentally flawed that the convictions couldn't stand, regardless of what actually happened that night in Houston? Korn assembled a team. In 2019, he recruited Drew Brenner Beck, a retired Army lieutenant colonel and military law professor, to lead what they called the Clemency Initiative. Brenner Beck brought in John Haymond, the military law historian whose book had led Holder to her great-uncle's grave 32 years earlier. They built a coalition of legal experts from across the country. The strategy was deliberate. Brenner Beck and Haymond knew they couldn't approach this case screaming words like lynching or applying modern standards of justice to 1917. The Army would shut down immediately. You have to get them past that visceral reaction, Brenner Beck explained. In order to then actually read what actually happened to these soldiers, they would use the military's own standards, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The rules the Army itself had established after recognizing the Camp Logan trials were flawed. They would demonstrate, using military law and military precedent, that these trials had violated even the minimal due process requirements of 1917. The petition was exhaustive. Hundreds of pages, thousands of hours of research. They documented every procedural deficiency. 63 men sharing one inexperienced defense attorney with 10 days preparation. No meaningful cross-examination of prosecution witnesses who couldn't identify specific defendants. Verdicts delivered within days with no opportunity for appeal. Death sentences carried out in secret. The team filed their first petition with the Army in October 2020. They filed a second, expanded petition in December 2021. Then they waited. The Army review process began under President Donald Trump's administration and continued under President Joe Biden. For 2 more years, Holder and the other descendants waited. They'd been waiting for over a century. What were a few more years? November 13th, 2023. Buffalo Soldiers National Museum, Houston. Angela Holder sat in the front row, surrounded by descendants of the executed soldiers. Jason Holt, attorney, great-nephew of Private Thomas Hawkins. Charles Anderson, relative of Sergeant William Nesbitt. Dozens of families who'd carried this pain for generations. Under Secretary of the Army, Gabe Camarillo stepped to the podium. After a thorough review, Camarillo announced, the board has found that these soldiers were wrongly treated because of their race and were not given fair trials. The room erupted in applause. The Army Board for Correction of Military Records has recommended that all 110 convictions be set aside. Secretary of the Army Christine Wormuth has approved this recommendation. The soldiers' service records will be corrected to reflect honorable discharges. Their families may now be eligible for survivors' benefits. Holder cried. She'd kept the promise she'd made as a 6-year-old girl. Jason Holt read aloud the names of the first 13 soldiers executed. Private Alfonso Butler, Corporal Robert Tillman, Private James Wheatley, Sergeant William Nesbitt, Private Jesse Moore. One by one, the names of men hanged in secret before dawn on December 11th, 1917. From the families of those executed to all of you, nothing can replace what we lost, Holt said, his voice breaking. taking their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, and so on cannot be replaced. That is lost forever in an ultimate abyss of what if. But today is in truth a day of atonement. Today, a mortal blow has been dealt to the injustice of the master-slave relationship, such that 106 years later, the color of their skin was not a barrier to the fair dispensation of military jurisprudence. And we all here rejoice that their convictions were overturned and set aside. The decision was unprecedented in American military history. The Army had overturned convictions before, individual cases, small numbers, but never anything like this. 110 convictions, 19 executions, 60 life sentences, all overturned simultaneously. The largest murder trial in American history. The largest court-martial in American history. Completely reversed. No case this large or this serious with this many death penalties has ever been completely overturned by the Army on review, Haymond said. The Army acknowledged what families had known for over a century. These men had been denied due process. They had been wrongly treated because of their race. Their trials were fundamentally unfair. The convictions could not stand. February 22nd, 2024, Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery, San Antonio. Angela Holder stood in the cold Texas morning, holding a photograph of Aunt Lovey. Proper headstones were being unveiled. 17 soldiers, including Corporal Jesse Moore, would finally have their stories told. Not just names and dates, full military records, ranks, service history. The Philippines, Mexico, Pancho Villa, the 24th Infantry Regiment's 60 years of distinguished service. All of it carved in stone. It can't bring them back, Holder said, tears streaming down her face. But it gives them peace. Their souls are at peace. She touched her great-uncle's new headstone. The first time I came here, I touched the headstone, and I said, "Oh man, this should not have happened to you, but I'm going to do something about that. The promise has been kept." It's been a lifelong mission for me. The implications of the Army's decision extended far beyond the 24th Infantry Regiment. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced it would work with families to provide survivors' benefits, potentially worth hundreds of thousands of dollars per family. Descendants who'd been denied VA loans, education benefits, and disability compensation because their ancestors died without honor would finally have access to what should have been their inheritance. The city of Houston declared February 20th Camp Logan Day, honoring the South Texas College of Law professors and students who'd researched the case. Memorial Park, built on the site of Camp Logan, installed proper historical markers explaining what had happened. The story could no longer be buried. But for Holder, the victory was bittersweet. Whatever we do, and I'm really sad when I say this, it won't undo the way that they died, she said. My uncle was 27 years old, and he was not married. He did not have children. No matter what we do now, it won't take away the hurt and the pain of his siblings, the pain that he endured, but it will give his spirit, his soul, peace to know that he did get justice. Jesse Moore's letter to his mother had promised he would be in glory. For 106 years, that promise stood alone. Now, finally, the United States Army had added its own words. Honorable, wrongly treated, denied due process, not guilty. The legacy Holder's family built from this tragedy speaks to something deeper than vindication. Jesse Moore's mother never recovered from her son's execution, but her family refused to let bitterness destroy them. Instead, they served. Jesse's nephews and great-nephews joined the military, serving with distinction. One reached the rank of colonel. They maintained, as Holder put it, a strong sense of justice and fairness, and continued optimism in the good of your fellow man. Even when the system had failed them so catastrophically, they continued to believe it could be reformed. They were right. It just took 106 years. The Houston Riot trials changed American military justice. The immediate outcry over the secret executions led to General Order No. 7, requiring review of all death sentences. That reform laid the foundation for the modern Uniform Code of Military Justice, which guarantees service members the right to appeal court-martial convictions. The Camp Logan trials demonstrated what happens when justice is denied, and now, the overturning of those convictions demonstrated that it's never too late to correct an injustice. Holder continues teaching history at Houston Community College, telling her students about Camp Logan, about her great-uncle, about what happens when racism infects the justice system. She poses the same question to her students that she posed to Professor Korn. You know where your pet hamster is buried? You know where your goldfish is buried. Why didn't my great-uncle get the same respect? The question isn't rhetorical. It demands an answer. And now, after 106 years, the United States Army has finally provided one, because one 6-year-old girl made a promise to her great-aunt, because that girl grew into a woman who refused to let history bury the truth, because Angela Holder understood something fundamental about justice. It may come slowly, it may take generations, but the wheels of justice do turn, and when they finally do, they can overturn even the largest mass execution in American military history.